I read A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki. This is a reread for me. It's a literary novel that is pretty weird. I don't know. I don't know how to talk about it. So it's kind of about time. That's in the title right there. And when it says time being, it's referring to an idea that each individual human being kind of has their own personal relationship to time. And so you are a time being. The plot of the book is kind of broken between two different characters, both women. One of them is a young woman named Nao, and she's living in Japan and writing in a journal. And the other part of the story is from the perspective of Ruth, who finds the journal years later washed up in Canada. The story is pretty simple in terms of plot. There's not like heavy action or anything, but it's incredibly dense with themes and ideas. And I think it's also on a certain level like about art and writing and what the elements of storytelling are in terms of character, time, and place. And that these are three of the most important constituent parts of modern like storytelling theory. And Ozeki is kind of self-consciously playing with them in kind of metatextual ways, exploring them really, not like playing with them. There's a very like deep respect for these elements of the story, but not to the point where it's reverential. She's just taking them seriously, but also examining some of the absurdity that can emerge when you do take things seriously. I don't know, like every time I've read this book, I have so many thoughts stirred up, but it's difficult to talk about it, especially in a kind of linear, beat by beat kind of way that I sometimes summarize books on this podcast, because in being about time, one of the things that emerges in stories as you go through is the meaning of the story, because meaning can only be constructed retroactively. And so once you know the ending of a story, all of its elements that preceded that ending kind of quilt into place and draw tight in terms of their meaning. And so when you reread the book, you can see like, this is building to that, or here is this theme introduced, or this character is doing this because, on and on like that. But the book is not interested necessarily in that kind of retroactivity. Instead, there's a meditation on a narrative sense of presence and not of future and past. And so Ruth is a novelist, and she talks about the ever-present now. And then also this other character, this teenage character who's writing in a journal, her name is now a kind of Japanese name, Nao, but pronounced out loud as now. And so when we think about in the material world, cause and effect relationships and a chain of consequence, cause and effect moves in a linear kind of motion from past to future, right? So like you push the boulder at the top of the mountain and then it causes a rock slide in the future. But when we think about the meaning of the rock slide event, we can only frame it in terms of the rock slide has already happened. And so then we will go hunt for the cause of it in a kind of backwards motion and then talk about why that happened and then what it all meant. So in other words, the rock slide, which is the effect, is actually the cause of the meaning, moving in a kind of backwards motion. Ozeki writes in a way as to arrest this entire kind of back and forth motion by having Ruth be a reader in the same way that we are a reader of the book. So we are reading the book, A Tale for the Time Being, but Ruth is reading the journal of now. And so she's trying to construct meaning at the same, like simultaneous to us trying to construct meaning of her constructing meaning. So you can see what I mean. There's like a metatextual kind of reflecting relationship that's like self-consciously kind of talking about the experience of reading and of writing, and kind of like talking about what writing actually is on an almost like material level, if you can talk about it that way. Like, yeah, there's words and sentences and all of that kind of thing, but all of those come together in order to deliver a time and place for characters to do things, and all of that works together to give us meaning for all of the context. Ruth insists on kind of not waiting to get to the end of the story to construct meaning. This is something that she does throughout the story, and that she is always in a kind of proximate contact with now as she exists in the journal up to the point at which she has read it so far. And so she doesn't think about the fact that the events that are referenced in the journal happened in the past for her. So at the time that this happens, there's been an earthquake in Japan that caused the Fukushima nuclear plant to go into meltdown, which is an event that happened in real life in the 2010s. And in the journal, the events of 9/11 are referenced as being like something that just happened. And so there's like a decade gap here of time between when Ruth is reading about now and when now is writing. But Ruth doesn't experience it that way. She takes now's intentions of committing suicide, or maybe that her father will commit suicide, as being immediate emergency circumstances that Ruth needs to step in right now and prevent the suicide attempts of this father and daughter. And if she doesn't, that they will definitely die, even though this happened like many, many years ago on the other side of the world, you know? So is that a misunderstanding of consequence, a not thinking through? Like, is Ruth just dumb? That's not how the story is presenting things. It's a commitment to her narrative idea as a writer, where she has to exist as she's writing a story. She has to treat it as if it is actually happening right now. It is unfolding in the same way that our reality is unfolding around us constantly. It's as if Ruth is kind of mapping the real world in real time, I guess, and capturing something in that whole thing. She's not constructing a story from, like thinking about the ending and working backwards. She is mapping it out as she travels through it and capturing something about the fact that like anything could happen in the future, right? Like the thing about the present is all of the possibilities that stand before us because the future is not determined. And it's that large amount of possibility in the future that gives the present the drama that it has. We can talk about the past in meaningful ways because it's foreclosed to us, and then we can try to like explain it to ourselves. Why did things unfold the way that they did in the past? And so the drama of the past comes from its relationship to its meaning to us now. But the drama of the present has to do with not knowing what's going to happen and making choices anyway. And in that way, Ruth's interpretation of the story as happening right now, even though it was written down a decade ago, exactly mirrors the way that we go through our lives. That we make choices without all of the information. We don't know how things are going to unfold in the future. We don't know that there's going to be earthquakes that will cause meltdowns of nuclear power plants or terrorist attacks that kill everybody in the buildings where they happen, or wars, or whatever thing is going to happen in the future, but we make our choices anyway. And when you look back and you think about like, oh, this person made the choice to go to work at the Twin Towers on the day that 9/11 happened, what a stupid choice to go to work on 9/11 at the top floor of the Twin Towers. That's like committing suicide, except the person didn't know what was going to happen, of course. And I think that's related to the way that Ruth is interpreting the story in real time, that this emergency is unfolding in front of her and she takes it seriously as happening right now because her vantage point in terms of time is fixed in the present. So now that I've talked about a whole bunch of concepts and been really confusing, let me talk about the actual plot. It's pretty simple. So Ruth is out at a beach where, for a hobby, her and her husband like to go out there and go beach combing or collect seaweed for their garden and things like that. And she is, like I said, she's a novelist, but she's kind of stuck with some writer's block. She doesn't know what to write next. And so part of the reason that she's going out to the beach is also looking for inspiration, something to inform what her next story is going to be. And she finds a like freezer bag, a big plastic freezer bag that has been sealed shut and it has barnacles growing on it and stuff. And inside is a lunchbox that's like a Hello Kitty lunchbox. And inside the lunchbox is the Proust novel that I'm not remembering the name of, but it's the first one of his famous story about like the loss of time or something like that, which is like super relevant to the book. But since I can't remember it, I can't remember it. So whatever. But when she opens the Proust book, it's not the Proust book. Instead, it is the Journal of Now, which the Proust book in reality is the recollections of, I mean, it's like a barely veiled biography of Proust himself with like some names changed and stuff like that. That's a really shallow reading of Proust's work, which I think is really wonderful and excellent. And there's probably like a really rich comparative reading that you could do of this novel and his series. But that's not what I'm thinking about. I do think it's relevant that Proust's novel starts out in childhood and kind of like tracks the early adulthood and kind of growing up in a particular time and place and like what all of that meant to him. And then the way that this novel is operating at the same time. So there's like this secret journal that's in the book, right? And now finds it. She's very curious about it. And she can tell from the choice of the like purple ink and the way the letters are written and whatnot, that this is a person who is a young woman and she's very curious about what's going on. So then she starts to read the journal, and that's when we enter into Now's story, which has to do with her being a 16-year-old girl, and they lived, her father, her mother, and her, they lived in America, I think, and maybe Canada. And then her father is a software engineer. He gets fired from his job, and they move to Japan to try and reset their life. And her father is so depressed over not having a job and not being able to secure any position in Japan that he starts to pretend like he has a job, and he just goes out every day and like gambles their money or drinks, and basically it just becomes like an unreliable loser, and eventually becomes suicidal because he's so filled with shame over the circumstances of his failure to be a father and a provider, that he thinks it would be better for them if he didn't exist at all. And this taps into a cultural idea of suicide that's particular to Japanese culture, but the intersection of it with, like modern globalist American perspectives on suicide as well. So there's kind of like a hybrid reading, I think, through the whole book, honestly. And this is true of like all of Ozeki's work, that I think there's like a way of reading Japanese culture, but through a lens of kind of North American culture simultaneously, that gives the book a unique energy. And so he understands that like this is probably not a great choice, but something deep in his cultural understanding of himself, in his identity, says that when you feel the level of shame that he does, that you have a responsibility to take ownership of the shame and pay for it literally with your life. But since his daughter grew up in North America, for the most part, she interprets that as giving up and of believing that she is not worth him trying harder and sticking around. And so both of those readings exist. It's a kind of meaning making in exactly the way that I was talking about earlier, that in thinking about the end of life, this pulls together all of the events of life and gives it a new context, except that meaning is different for now than it is for her father, right? And that's because meaning is always particular to the audience of the story and not necessarily governed by the author themselves. And this is something that Ruth acknowledges, and I guess by default Ozeki is acknowledging early in the book, where she talks about where the meaning of a story comes from and how the story needs an audience to provide that interpretation. Because like Now's entire narrative voice in the journal is also very metatextual, where it's directly addressing the reader and talking about a you. I wonder who you are. I wonder if you like this. I wonder if you like that. Because what Now is really doing, like in the present, in her own moment, is consoling herself. She's actually writing to herself to try and, I think unconsciously, figure out what she thinks about things, because her mother is not available to her, because eventually her mother has to get a job to support the family, and she can't talk to her father because her problem is actually caused by her father. And these things are kind of like unspeakable between them in terms of their relationship, right? She is just now coming into her womanhood at 16 years old. This is the time in life in Japan where you become an adult, and her father is failing to be an adult, a provider. And for her to confront him with that is it just makes everybody too vulnerable. And so the only place that she can go to talk about these things is to herself. But she can't, like, that's weird, right? But this is part of the point of having a journal or a diary, because you can kind of like, quote unquote, tell the diary. And this helps you to work out what you actually think and feel about a given situation. And so the story that now is telling herself is that she's writing in this journal to chronicle the life of her 104-year-old grandmother, who is a Zen Buddhist monk. And because she loves her grandmother, it's the only adult that she doesn't have a complicated relationship with in terms of like having to take care of them. The degree to which she has to take care of her grandmother is just pretty normal ways of that the younger generations care for the elderly, and not the way in which she is more competent than her father, who is supposed to be the rock solid provider of the family. Like, that is a dysfunctional relationship that she has with her father. And so she wants to tell the story of her grandmother, and that is the purpose in her mind of writing in this book. But she never gets around to doing that. Instead, she writes to herself. And that's why I say that the entire exercise is unconscious and that the real audience for now is herself. But Ruth takes it as this book was kind of meant for her specifically and was deliberately kind of addressed to her, not in the sense of like now knew that Ruth was out there somewhere and would read this, but that, you know, like the universe, quote unquote, kind of brought it to her, and that there's a kind of serendipity to the whole thing. So on top of this dual protagonist relationship that's happening, where you have now as the writer of the journal and Ruth as the reader of the journal, we also start to get reflections of these two characters within the journal narrative. And so what happens plot-wise is that now is kind of handed off to her great-grandmother, who was or is a Zen Buddhist monk. And when she was a young woman, she was like a feminist, an anarchist, a novelist. And it was like this, you know, cool character in her younger years. And then all of that turned into a kind of focused spiritual practice of becoming Buddhist monk, who takes the vow of the bodhisattva to try and bring all living beings to a state of enlightenment before she allows herself to become enlightened. And I think in some ways, Jiko is a kind of reflection of Ruth, in that she is a novelist. She is someone who is worried about now's future, and that she's very concerned about the idea of suicide. And she wants now and her father to choose to remain alive and not to be consumed by this idea of dying, which, you know, lines up with the idea of enlightenment for all creatures and that kind of thing. But at the same time, you know, like Jiko is over 100 years old. And so her own mortality is very, very close to her. She knows that she's going to die soon, but she's not eager to get there. She's not trying to avoid pain. She's not consumed with shame and things like that. Instead, she's allowing a natural process to happen, and she is at peace with her own nature. And so there's something in the wisdom of all of that, in the way in which she is emotionally connected to her family, that feels like Ruth in the story to me, in the way that she emotionally connects to now and her father through reading the journal. And that reflection is fixed in a certain kind of time sense. Like I said, like each one of these people is a time being. But where Ruth's perspective is in this kind of ever-present now, Jiko has a perspective that's rooted in the wisdom of Zen. Because the vow that Jiko takes about bringing all beings to enlightenment before she allows herself to come to enlightenment would make no sense if we're thinking about a regular materialist kind of understanding of time and cause and effect, like I was talking about before. Instead, the Zen Buddhist idea of time that's introduced in the book through the works of Dogen, who was the founder of the Soto school of Zen Buddhism, is the origin of this whole time being concept in the novel. And basically, what he is saying when he's talking about the term time being is that if you exist, then time is a fundamental element of your existence. And that we all exist in time, which interconnects us in a fundamental way to each other, no matter what period of time you exist in. And so we would tend to think that time separates us, like Dogen lived a long time ago compared to me, and therefore we are not connected. But in actuality, according to Dogen's philosophy, we would be tightly connected because we both exist. And in the same way, Ruth and Now are tightly connected to each other in time. Because of their existence, the time distance between them shrinks to zero. Even though many years have passed since the journal was written, and between when it was written and when it is read, it doesn't matter because the amount of time for Ruth is down to zero in terms of her experience of Now's story. So getting back to Jiko, if she's going to save all creatures, how is this possible when she's over 100 years old? She's going to die very soon. She doesn't have very much time left. Well, she has all the time in the universe is the answer because everything is connected. And so whenever that time happens of all other beings coming into their full enlightenment, that will be the point at which Jiko achieves her own enlightenment and follows everyone through into nirvana. And so this is a fundamentally different way of understanding time, I guess. That's an important philosophical concept in the book. And so while Ruth is like scrambling to assemble meaning as she is moving through the journal, Jiko is assembling meaning in the sense that like there is no rush to do anything because there's infinite amount of time as long as you exist. That there is no difference between time and existence. And while that might seem like a kind of paradox or a contradiction, that's typical of Zen thinking in the Buddhist tradition. And so there's a lot of times in the book where it talks about, Jiko does this especially, where opposites will be talked about, and then Jiko will say, oh yeah, those are the same, but they're different. So it's like, you talk about like the highest peak and the deepest ocean, it'd be like, oh yeah, those are the same, but different. And what she means there is that these concepts are directly related to each other because they interpenetrate each other in terms of creating their meaning, the understanding of them. Like you cannot understand what light is without darkness and vice versa. And so while they seem to be opposites, they actually exist on a spectrum with each other. And they're not the same in that they define each other as kind of antipodes on that spectrum, but they are the same in the fact that they're in a direct relationship that interpenetrates and defines each other. And I think that kind of relationality and the way that people can be defined by each other and affected by each other comes into play in a direct kind of magical realism moment later in the novel. And so that's part of the reason why these ideas get introduced at this point in the story, so that we can start to get used to them because of the relationship that Ruth and Now are going to have, in terms of like Ruth steps in with some agency into Now's story, which would seem to be impossible, but it's not impossible if you understand time in the way that Jiku does, and you understand the relationship between things that are not the same, in that they are directly related to each other and are actually kind of the same. So another character that gets introduced at this point, Jiko tells Now about her great uncle, who would have been Jiko's brother, and that is who her father is named after. And he was a soldier in World War II. And so he was recruited from college into the military against his will. So he's drafted into the military, is what I mean. And then he's assigned to become a kamikaze pilot. And so he's going to sacrifice his life to kill the enemy or cripple their ships or whatever the plan is to do that. And so I think that he is a kind of narrative reflection of Now's father, because they literally have the same name, but also their story is very similar in that Now's father worked for a software company, and they were making video games about like shooting people and kind of military simulation games. And the military was really interested in the ways in which that software could be used with drone pilots. And so you would hook it up to a real weapon, and then someone could use the game interface to actually kill people on a battlefield with the software. And Now's father was not comfortable with this, and he tried to make it stop and ended up getting himself fired, and then got a bad reputation because of that. And this is the reason why he's out of work, but Now doesn't know about that. And in the same way, her great uncle was a philosophy student. And then when he encountered the war effort and the kamikaze training, he had a similar ideological response to the whole thing, where he was not interested in killing other people or using his plane to destroy Japan's enemies. And so he rebelled against what he was meant to do, what he was required to do, and still drove the plane, like killed himself with the plane, but didn't do it in a way where he would kill anybody else. And so we have these twin themes of suicide. Now's father feels this shame that around his duty, even though he decided to do the, morally right thing of trying to prevent war from happening. It cost him his career, which was a fundamental part of his identity, and therefore led to the shame that makes him want to commit suicide to reclaim his honor. In the same way, Now's great uncle wanted to do the kamikaze mission because that would make sure that his family got his war benefits at a higher rate than if he was just killed as a low-level soldier. But he didn't want to do it in a way where he hurt anybody else. And so the idea of the suicide there in both cases is somehow a benefit to the family, but the kind of pain that it creates in both cases seems to be not worth the benefit. And both men are morally upright in ways that are really important. And also, Now's father has this whole relationship with philosophers where he's taking the philosophers' actual writings and like tearing the pages out of books and making origami with them. And so there's just lots of different complex ways in which these characters are mirrored and how they're situated in different eras of time, but also showing how the problems that we have as human beings are fundamentally the same, even though the context and details are different. And so both men are trying to fulfill the role of being a provider, protecting their family, having a reputation that allows their loved ones to respect them and for them to respect themselves. But there's a kind of like onerous duty that's put on them by society and a military machine that's trying to exploit them in some way. And so all the details around all of that stuff is different for both of them, but fundamentally, they're in a similar scenario. And I think Ruth herself, in a certain way, is a reflection of, Ruth Ozeki, the writer of the book. They share the same name, they share the same occupation. I'm sure that a lot of the observations that Ruth as a character in the book has about writing and being a novelist are, reflected by Ruth, the actual author. And we should understand her in terms of being a character within a novel and not merely a puppet for Ozeki to, say whatever she thinks. But I do think that she's kind of playing with that boundary there because it's a signal to us as the readers that that same kind of play is happening between the other characters who are separated, between the journal and the not journal world. And even within the journal, there's, the writings of this great uncle exist in the French language so as to hide them from the Japanese officers who would recognize that his actions are treasonous. And so he's doing the same thing that Now does in terms of like hiding a journal. So this is a journal within a journal. And we should understand that these characters reflect each other, that they have a direct relationship to each other symbolically within the novel. And the signal that that is part of the structure of the book is by naming Ruth after herself, I think. So Now learns about Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, from her great grandmother, and she enjoys that, but she's still worried about her father. She doesn't like that she's been separated from her parents, even though she loves Jiko. But this is the point at which she really gets to know Jiko. She finds out about her past when she was younger, that she was an anarchist and a feminist and a novelist and all that stuff. And she wants to write about her life, which is what inspires her to start the journal project. And so the whole thing kind of exists because of Jiko as an inspiration, if you will. And so that's kind of why I also link her to Ruth as the novelist storyteller, and then Ruth Ozeki, as the origin point of everything that is in the book. And so there's like all these reflections happening, all these relationships and connections down through the novel. The other big theme in the book has to do with quantum physics and the same kind of relationality that exists in quantum physics, but also the kind of alternate world theory that is important to quantum physics nowadays. So there's a famous thought experiment around quantum physics that has to do with Schrodinger's cat. And this is directly talked about in the novel. And in fact, there's a cat named Schrodinger in the book who goes missing at one point. It belongs to Ruth and her husband, Oliver. And Schrodinger goes missing, and they don't know if Schrodinger is dead or alive. Because in the thought experiment, Schrodinger, the scientist Schrodinger, came up with this thought experiment where he has a cat. He puts the cat into a box with some poison, and the poison may or may not kill the cat. We don't know the cat is alive or dead unless we open the box and see. And so the cat can be thought of to be both alive and dead at the same time because we don't observe which state the cat is in. And this has to do with the idea of superposition for subatomic particles in physics that we can't ever actually measure the exact position and speed of a particle at the same time. We can only know one or the other. And whenever we observe the particle, we affect its speed and or position. And so observing things affects them. And this causes basically, for modern theory, a kind of splitting of worlds. And so the idea is that if you open the box to look and see if the cat is alive or dead, and you see that the cat is alive, that means that another world has split off in which the cat is dead. And so in your world, the cat is alive. In this other world, the cat is dead. And that both of those universes actually exist. And this is true for like every kind of quantum superposition situation. And so if you think about Ruth as the observer and now as the person in kind of a superposition, because her story existed, like in a literal Hello Kitty box. So a kind of Schrodinger's box, right? And if we think of her inside the box and she has this kind of poison of the idea of suicide, and her father might commit suicide as well. So there's a chance that now is going to be dead or alive, kind of inside the box. She is a type of Schrodinger's cat, in other words. And so the unfolding of the story, the reading of the journal for Ruth is a observing of the cat, the now, to find out if she's alive or dead. And you could be like, well, it's a journal, so it's already written and it's already an established fact in the past, whether she is alive or not. That's how material cause and effect works. Except that we're operating on this kind of Dogen time being philosophical plane for this book. And then also mixing that up with quantum physics, where being an observer affects the outcome directly. It's not just that things would have played out exactly the way that they would have, whether you observed or not. It is that in observing, you cause a particular outcome to happen. And so at one point, Ruth is reading the story and reading the journal, and she goes to flip the page and there's no more writing in the journal, even though she's previously checked to make sure that the journal was completely full, that every last page had writing on it. Now there are many, many pages that don't have writing on it. And so she kind of goes into a panic about this and ends up going into a kind of dreamlike state where she's kind of meditating on the text. She's getting into this Zen mindset. And all of these events that she has read about pull together through different periods of time, and then also her own personal life and all of these different things. They kind of like these disparate elements of her experience pull together in this surreal kind of magical moment. And she directly kind of like pushes now towards not committing suicide. And then when she goes back and checks the journal, the pages are all filled out again. The story continues, and the outcome is that now and her father reconcile. She finds out the truth about his conscience, the reason that he lost his job, and she decides not to commit suicide and becomes a healthier person. And so there's lots of things that I'm like leaving out of the story, but I'm also like just bringing in all these different elements that I think are maybe kind of confusing to listen to and are so fundamental to understanding the book but I don't think there's any way to really talk about the book other than like reading the book. Like it's a really difficult book to summarize because of its relationship to its themes on a meta level, but also its emotional resonance, which I'm really not capturing at all in terms of like everything that I'm talking about. There's like the Zen Buddhism and Dogen and on and on. I'm not talking about like the crushing sadness of Nao's story, the desperation of Ruth, her relationship with her husband that is a real teeter-totter between frustration and admiration, and a delicate trust and affection between the two of them. And, the way that Nao's father feels about her and tries to protect her, the frustration of her mother, and on and on and on. There's like a deep emotional story that happens in this novel that I'm not able to articulate with all of these other really wonderful elements happening at the same time. And so I don't know. I don't know a good way to talk about the book. This is part of the project for me, is that I want to talk about things off the top of my head. I don't want to bog myself down by doing heavy research and then bringing those things together like this. Doing what I would want to do with this novel would have to be an act of writing where I would have to really meditate on it and edit things and bring things in and pull things back out. But by practicing talking about it just off the top of my head, I'm kind of forcing myself, and this is a kind of Zen practice type of thing, I guess is what I'm saying. I'm forcing myself to encounter this book as its own time being that I have to reckon with like right now. And this forms a new habit in my mind and my brain to put together concepts more smoothly and get to the point better. But I feel like I am completely failing at that. And so like maybe I'm a little bit captured in the despair of Now and her father, I don't know, or the lost feelings that Ruth has as she's scrambling through most of the book. But I really love the novel. I hope that comes through in what I'm saying. And a lot of it is probably over my head, and there's all kinds of things I'm sure that I'm not seeing and I'm missing. But it's just another reason to go back to her work again and reread the book and try to take another bite at the apple in the future.